Hello, and welcome to this edition of Real Women. Today we're going to talk about marriage, and I think probably a good place to start might be looking at kind of how marriage is perceived in the culture today. What is our experience of marriage? Now, I was married 37 years ago, so we prepared for it differently. We experienced it a little bit differently than younger women do today. So you can see why I love working at Endow with these colleagues who are vibrant and young and will bring a different perspective to the subject of marriage. I guess I'd like to start today about just kind of getting the lay of the land when it comes to marriage. I was married 37 years ago. Our preparation for the sacrament and for the event was probably different from how you experienced it. I know it was very different from how my mother went through it, but we're at a very funny time now in history that everything just seems up for grabs, and that marriage, an institution begun and established by God Himself, just seems to be kind of open to redefinition. I mean, that's where we are right now in the culture. So I wonder if we could start by just kind of offering your insights into what marriage looks like through the lens of modernity.
I would say, thinking of marriage in our modern world, and thinking of a lot of, I know beautiful marriages who've lasted and, really try to live out their Catholic life, but typically in the modern world, living in Los Angeles and having a brother who lives in New York and the midst of these urban areas, there's a lack of permanence that comes with it. And I know we had a discussion earlier over breakfast, but talking about how it's marriage only seems to last as far as it is useful or as long as somebody's happy. So the idea that it is forever, ever, and to be completely faithful and to live out all the obstacles with that person doesn't seem to be as real as it was maybe once in the past. And things that come into play. I mean, a lot of the women I know cohabitate, and it's not because that, they are trying to do something that is against church teaching or our faith or how we know would be the fullness, but really with the intention of their heart, they think that that is the most responsible thing to do in order to discern if this is truly the right person. So everything seems to be a little bit skewed, and I guess the overall thing I see is an extreme need for control, because it's all up to them to make sure it works perfectly, and if it's out of their control, then it won't, and that need to kind of put their arms around it rather than completely giving up to God. So those, I say, were the main things I see constantly around me, and again, not because of lack of intention, but just lack of formation and knowledge.
Yeah, and I think relevant to that is a general misunderstanding about what love is. So many people think that love is a feeling, an emotion, like an infatuation. But our emotions, we know, especially as women, come and go, and they're not predictable. And so if people are using their emotions as a litmus of the value of their marriage, that gets really dangerous. But as Catholics, we know that love, authentic love, is rooted in the will. It's, I desire your good. So even if I don't feel like going to see that movie with my husband, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to choose to do it joyfully because I love him and I want to honor him. It's not so much about my feelings. Oftentimes it's when there's no feelings that it becomes real love, because there's the element of sacrifice. If Christ's example from the cross is, the epitome of love, of the perfect act of love, the perfect act of self-gift. Christ didn't feel good hanging on the cross, right? But it's the perfect symbol and sign and example for, in any vocation truly, but certainly within marriage, of I'm called to lay my life down for the good of the other. And so if I understand that's essential to the character of the sacrament of marriage, the element of sacrifice and being made holy through sacrifice, then my expectations are going to be wildly different from the secular culture's, I think, depiction of marriage.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of love as a choice, like I choose it every day, I choose to love you. But I mean, generally speaking, our culture is so much into, as you were saying, do what feels good. Do what feels good and do what makes you happy, no matter the consequences. It's all about me.
Right.
So the idea of giving yourself as a gift to another completely is just so radical, especially, the more we get into the, effects of the pill and everything like that, where people can push it's becoming more, we were talking earlier about how people push off getting married and push off having kids because they have that control. And so, they can plan their life in a way that they weren't able to before. So then it's all about, I can choose these things instead of, plan it my way instead of.
Not go off that. Now I'm having a recall of, one of my good friends from high school was talking to me about, she's, about to get married, and she was saying, it's all about compromise. And she goes, if I do this, then he has to do that. And I remember thinking, and I had that conversation, I said, well, what about sacrifice? I was like, you can't expect something in return, but it's totally giving of yourself. She said, I really think it's compromise. Like, the sacrifice wasn't even her vocabulary because it seemed too strong.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's something that the church teaches, and obviously the lives of the saints, and we see so many different witnesses, but the idea, difference between those words. I think people are willing to make somebody else happy as long as it's equal.
Yes.
Rather
as
than
long as
saying,
they get something in return.
I
Quid
don't
pro
expect
quo.
anything.
Yeah.
That's very good. And I like what you said about it wasn't even in her vocabulary. I think one of the things that's kind of missing today when we approach sacraments is that we don't have maybe the proper formation or the language that we can learn from the church, how she understands it. A priest of my acquaintance had said one time, obviously now he's the pastor of a very large suburban parish. He's really in the thick of it all the time with families and so on. And it grieved him that the sacrament people seemed to be least prepared for was marriage. They presented themselves for the sacrament of marriage, really having a notion about it, or many notions that were kind of formed or integrated into them from who knows where. But very often it was not the sacrament of holy matrimony as the church understands, teaches, and proclaims it. So one of the things that our church has given us, and what we're going to kind of home in on today, is the teaching in the encyclical Humani Vitae. And in there's a great piece, and what we're going to focus on is Article 9, where the Pope gives us a little tutorial on the characteristics of Christian marriage. But first, I would just like to say this, that having been around at that time as a young teenager and kind of watching what was going on around me, as I think about it now, I kind of see like people flailing, kind of floundering and semi-drowning in this roiling sea of sexual confusion and real sexual chaos. In my imaginings, Paul VI in Rome puts pen to paper. He writes the way out of this mess. Like, here comes your life preserver. And it's like he rolls it up in a little bottle and kind of hurls it into the sea, where it sort of bobs around unnoticed for quite some time. But people ignored his message to their peril.
Eileen, didn't people think Paul VI was going to be more radical and different? And so then when he said this message, they were kind of shocked. Kind of like people think Pope Francis right now is going to be completely different, and we're all waiting to see his writings and all that. But Humani Vitae was kind of, he just went right down with the truth in church teaching, and it never changed. And that was, as he's writing this, that was a huge deal.
And it was shocking because in 1920, the Anglicans had decided that contraception would be morally permissible within the context of marriage for serious moral reasons. And pretty much many other Christian denominations had followed suit. And so everyone was the Catholic Church was kind of the last one to fall, and everyone was expecting that would happen. And even a majority of moral theologians who were consulted on this came back and said, yes, we think that it would be prudential to admit of birth control in these very specific circumstances for the married and for serious reasons, etc. And so then it was a total shock when Humani Vitae then comes out and says, no, actually the church is not changing her teaching on this, and here's why. But I think you're right in saying it goes kind of unnoticed because most people didn't actually read the document. A lot of people say, well, I'm not behind Humani Vitae, and you'll kind of press them. Have you actually read it?
Yeah.
Well, no, but I know what it says. Yeah, sure you did. No, you haven't. You haven't read it. You don't know the beauty of it. You haven't experienced the very reasonable, cogent arguments and the beauty and dignity of marriage that's put forth. You just know you don't like the consequences for your own life. It's a difficult teaching to follow.
Why don't we talk about the characteristics that he lays out,
Oh, yeah,
Paul
good
VI,
call.
of marriage, and then we'll get to the other part of it. Because if you only could do two things from the encyclical, people would zero in on the characteristics of marriage and the dire predictions. So let's look at those four things. What he does is he's kind of slow out of the starting gate, but then he hits stride, the Pope does, and he's like inviting us, let's go back and see if we really understand what marriage is. And he says that Christian marriage has four characteristics to it. He says it's human, it's total, it's faithful, and it's fruitful. So let's kind of go through each one of those. Emily, would you like to speak to the first one? Well, isn't that a no-brainer? Why is the Pope even saying it's human?
Yeah, so their philosophy actually becomes really helpful, right? You look at nature, and what you see happens in nature, in the animal kingdom, is that like a male and a female will couple together and bring forth offspring. So you might be tempted to think that marriage is kind of just part and parcel to what animals do. It's a matter of instinct. You know, male and female are sexually attracted to each other and they bring forth life. But by saying human, what you're attending to is, it's not just a matter of like on the animal level of instinct. What you're attending to is man's particular dignity made in the image and likeness of God. How are we distinguished from the rest of creation? Well, it's that we're rational animals. And what that means is that we have a soul that's immortal. And with that comes two things that the animals don't have. We have an intellect and we have a will. And the intellect allows us to know, and our will allows us to choose. And so essential to the sacrament being valid is your intellect, knowing, having full knowledge of what you're saying yes to, and your will being free. If husband Joe had dragged me up to the altar like by my hair, right, and said, now you're gonna marry me or I'm gonna kill your whole family, right? The Barry family will be killed off. Everyone would recognize, well, that's not a valid marriage because your will isn't free. So too, you can't, in order for a true yes, your intellect has to be involved. We see with the Blessed Mother at the Annunciation. She asks questions in order to say yes, to give her fiat. She has to ask, how can this be since I do not know man? And the angel Gabriel tells her. So in order for it to be a marriage, a real marriage, it has to be human. And by that we mean it's not just something that's on the level of animal instinct, it's authentically human. It engages our intellect and our will, our souls, our whole yes is involved.
That's a beautiful definition of, and a beautiful reason why the Pope starts with, it's human. Number one, right out of the gate, let's understand what that is, what that component is.
I give you, the good and the bad and the sick and the health. I give you my full fertility.
Do they know that language of self-gift? That ought to be second nature to Catholic.
Love is a choice, and it's, you have to work for it, and it's, not every day are you gonna feel the same way.
But it's love that is total and exclusive to the Trinity.
Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord, Jesus has the victory.
We all have a call to greatness, a desire for it. We want to do something good.
Now is your time. You could change the world, and the world needs changing, so get busy.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
And the other thing that the Pope says, number two, he says, the second characteristic of marriage is that it's total. Total. Would you like to speak to that, Kathy?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to what I was sharing before about my friend who was between compromise and sacrifice. And in total, it is that complete sacrifice of self, so complete giving. And as we were chatting about earlier, so often in marriage, it's saying, I'm giving you everything as long as you make me happy, or there's always a condition on it. I'm giving you everything except I want to have this 2-year period of being financially stable and saving before we can have children, or I'm giving, everything except we have these human conditions that we're penetrated by all the time. But I think what Paul VI was talking about is total, is when you say that yes and you're on the altar and you're making that vow, who are saying, I give you 100% today and forever. I give you, the good and the bad and the sick and the health. I give you my full fertility when we become one. I give you all of my weaknesses, all of my strengths, and the potential for all of my womanhood as much as I want to get your manhood. And I think it's something we shared earlier that nobody supports it in our culture because there are all these conditions. Or again, reverting back to our previous conversation, and this is the need for control. This is I think what's so common is this is how I envision it, and this is how I think marriage should be. And it's this fairy tale, or the media tells us, or what we dream as little girls, which should be that knight on shining armor, but there's also the human part. And so as soon as we kind of realize that those obstacles and those challenges are there for us to become only better, that total gift should be with complete joy.
Right.
But we get scared and we say, but everything except for this because I'm afraid of this, or, it's not perfect in how I envisioned it. And so it's both those people saying yes, and that completely being whatever it is, I give it to God and I give it to you.
That's beautifully put. And I think one of we talked earlier about having the language. Do Catholics coming up today, as part of their catechesis, do they have that in their bloodstream? Do they know that language of self-gift? That ought to be second nature to Catholics. And today, we talked earlier too about what's different today as opposed to a generation and two ago. You have the phenomenon of the prenuptial agreement, which really codifies the idea that we don't really trust somebody else with our whole self.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, just with money.
Right.
We don't trust you with money. It's not even, my full yes and my flesh and my, that's what's so amazing is we're so concerned about the material.
Right,
Oh, yeah.
right. Okay, so he goes on, all right, it's human, it's total, and then he says it's faithful. Okay, now this is the one thing probably everybody entering into marriage kind of has an idea of that. Would you like to speak to that, Shannon?
Sure. I think the idea of, it's kind of like we talked about, certain words have a density of meaning and connotation that culturally kind of scares some people, like faithfulness or, commitment. It's such strong words, full devotion, and I think our culture shies away from those kinds of extremes because it is, a commitment, and so being faithful. And I think in, Humana Vitae, he acknowledges that it's hard, but I think it goes back to like we were talking about earlier, love is a choice, and it's, you have to work for it, and it's, not every day are you going to feel the same way, but it's this, discipline and sacrifice and the idea that you will always work to be faithful to this person. And I think that's kind of even just in friendships or any kind of relationship nowadays, just because of our culture. It's a radical idea. And I think it's hard for some people to get wrap their heads around. And we see different manifestations of it.
And I like the idea that we're surfacing so many things here, and it makes you mindful that marriage is really something to be worked at. And not because it's drudgery, but because it's incredibly valuable and it deserves our best effort. And we deserve to bring our best selves to it. I mean, if we want it to be, all marriages influence the culture for good or for ill. If we want to be on the side that really influences the culture for good, that's something we're going to work at. Yeah. And we're going to model it.
Whose marriage of public or private individuals do you admire and why?
Oh, well, I'll have to go first of all with my parents. They've been married for 29 years, and it's a second marriage for both of them. They went through an annulment with their first marriages, and now are in a true marriage that God had called them to. And they were 40, 41, and 42 when they had me, so they were still open to life, which is not as common for couples to get married at a later age. And I'm clearly very grateful for that. And that would be the first marriage that I admire, because I can go to my mother for advice when it comes to how to have a God-centered marriage today. For me, my husband and I have been married for only 2 years, and we have 2 children. So her wisdom and experience are invaluable. She's a daily communicant, so the graces that she receives from that, she offers up rosaries and fasting for her children, and I have more than reaped the benefits of those sacrifices. I have a fruitful life today because of that. and she's also a third order Dominican. So I guess, I don't know, the list goes on. I love her resume, and I would love to have one as fruitful as hers.
How is the Catholic understanding of marriage so special and different from civil marriage?
So the Catholic understanding of marriage versus a civil marriage, well, in the Catholic Church, it is God's presence here on earth. So in the sacraments, we get to participate in something that's happening in heaven in a earthly way, I guess, is a very sloppy way of describing a sacrament. But here I know that it is not up to me to fulfill my husband and his happiness, and it's not up to him to make me happy either. We work through the grace that God gives us, and we've made that commitment together. It wasn't given to us by the priest, or it wasn't signed by the government. So we work with our Lord to fulfill what he asks of us in this beautiful invitation in marriage of the beautiful Trinity.
In one word, can you describe what is the best thing about a happy marriage?
Maybe this is too easy. Sacrifice? One word? Do I have to give a definition with that? Sacrifice, well, that can entail a lot of other one words. Selflessness, giving, dying into oneself, trying to be Christ-like. You know, the whole thing for Corinthians, when everybody reads at a wedding and all the women go, oh, I'm not going to do what my husband says. But what we don't know, or at least what some people don't know, is that for a woman to serve her husband is because a husband is going to die for his wife, just like Christ died for his church. So yeah, sacrifice, and I'm learning all about it, and some days better than others. So thank God for confession.
Christian marriage is human, it's total, it's faithful, and now he's getting to the crux of everything, okay? It's fruitful. Would you like to speak to that, Emily?
Sure. I think that we've mentioned this before, right? The hinge point for moral theology is always the dignity of the human person, and the human person's dignity is rooted in the fact that he's made in the image and likeness of God. So if you want to understand, well, what am I called to as a human person? I'm called to image the Trinity, okay? So then what is the Trinity like? What we see in the Trinity is total, obviously not human because it's divine, right? God has a different nature than we do. But it's love that is total and exclusive to the Trinity. The Father pours himself out in love to the Son pours himself out in love to the Father, and the fruit of this love is the third person, the Holy Spirit. So emblematic to the understanding of perfect love is this fruitfulness. And Christian marriage is called to imitate that, is called to imitate the fruitfulness that you see within the Trinity. That's what total dynamic love does. I remember very distinctively one evening after my first daughter was born, Bridget, holding her. She was probably 3 months old. And she had really, babies go through little growth spurts. And she'd really put on weight very quickly. She was really feeling heavy in my arms. And I was thinking, my gosh, this is the incarnation of our spousal love. Like Scott Hahn, who's a great Catholic theologian, will say, the love between a husband and wife is so dynamic that 9 months you have to give it a name. That's what you're experiencing right now, Catherine, right? Yeah.
That's a great line.
Isn't that beautiful? And I know for myself that I before getting married, I would watch other Catholic friends of mine kind of have honeymoon babies. I remember just feeling a little anxious about it, oh my gosh, you're gonna go from being married to a mother like that, doesn't it, maybe it's prudential, or maybe there's good reasons why you could practice NFP well and just wait a little while to be open to having children. And blessed be God, a good holy priest kind of talked me out of that. And lo and behold, God in his goodness, my husband and I did have a honeymoon baby. We went to Rome to get our marriage blessed by the Pope and Pope Benedict. It was a very efficacious blessing. We came home with a little more than pasta. And I remember thinking, it's almost like when you read a beautiful story, and at the end, everything comes together and it all fits. And you say to yourself, oh, of course, why didn't I see that was coming? Why didn't I see that would be the perfect ending to it, And that's how I felt getting pregnant, on the other side of marriage, with the graces of the sacrament supporting our love, realizing, of course, the love that I feel for my spouse would result in a new life, of course.
The church has nothing but good news, but really, when you look at Humani Vitae, no discussion of Humani Vitae is complete without at least touching on the predictions and he is prophetic. And I think that's why people are more willing to take a look at this 1968 encyclical here in modern times, because we've had 45 plus years of living with the effects. And we see that it's correct, that the predictions really are correct.
And I remember when I read it, that was kind of what stuck with me most of all, is the predictions. And it was one of those, like, of course, like, you can absolutely see these things come true. But I can't recall exactly what all of them were, but they were very telling and, as you said, very prophetic at that time.
Sure, like, what's going to happen if we adopt the contraceptive mentality? One thing Paul VI says is that there's going to be a general lowering of morality. Yeah. Now, I don't know who's going to argue with that. The second thing he says is that man will lose respect for woman. I think we can give a bunch of examples for that. Not sure how necessary it is. And then there's two more, Emily.
Sure. So the third one is that there would be a misuse of contraception by public authorities. So the state really trying to regulate the number of children that a family can have.
I think the fact that he made those predictions and all of it really has come true is something that makes Humanae Vitae so compelling and really worth a second look today. And but as we know, the church has nothing but good news in this area. You know, we started talking about people in this roiling sea of sexual confusion, and then, you know, the Pope throws in a message in a bottle. Here is your way out. So it's a great time to be married. It's a great time to be raising a family in the church. Catherine, over here, is there anything that you would like to kind of say to close our segment? On a good note, which is what the church is always about, joy and hope.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in any situation, in this specific topic, you know, we see people who are completely confused or going away from good marriages or, you know, in a contraceptive culture, but they are, so often they are being lost. But when you become that lost and you kind of, you know, veer away from the path, there is a craving for the truth. And once you've experienced that, and I think the beauty of our faith is that no matter how far off you go, as soon as you come back to the truth, the greater your joy and the greater your love for Christ can be. He can take the darkest sin or the darkest path and make it the brightest light. And so no matter where you are or how far you've gone, you know, that's the beauty, is the truth reigns all. And there's total freedom with it, no matter where you are. And he calls each and every one of us, from the prodigal son to the perfect son to, you know, to it all. And also, you know, no matter what city I've lived in, and even working for Endow and, you know, being part of all these ministries, that there are so many good Catholic, Christian, you know, moral, beautiful people who are striving for good families. And, you know, we're all human, but there's such a beautiful community globally, and it's all revolved around the church and our faith. And, and you know, you have those moments or those bad days, and you come back to it and you say, it's so much bigger than me. And there's that constant reminder. So as a new mom and just experiencing all of this, and I'm just incredibly grateful for the faith and the truth, and no matter where you go, he always draws you back, and then the fact that you can join together with others who are searching for the same truth.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. And may God continue to bless all of us in our vocations and to make us appreciative of real lasting love and the sanctity of life. And that's our show for today. Thank you very much for joining us on Real Women. We hope you'll be back with us another time.